December 17, 1942, 04:30 hours, Labrador Peninsula, eastern Canada. The world outside was an unbroken wasteland of snow and wind, the kind that buried tents, silenced men, and stripped skin from bone. Sergeant William "Bill" Morrow pressed a gloved hand against the frostbitten side of a half-track, his breath crystallizing in the thin air. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. The aurora above shifted in ghostly ribbons, flickering like the pulse of something alive and watching. To the south, beyond a wall of black spruce, the muffled engines of his platoon grumbled awake, coughing smoke into the Arctic dark. The temperature was 40 below and dropping. These were the men the British press had mocked as the frozen few. But by the end of that winter, even the Americans would speak their name with something between disbelief and respect. They called themselves the 1st Special Service Force, a joint Canadian-American experiment designed for mountain and winter warfare. The idea had come from a mad colonel and a frustrated engineer who believed that victory in Europe might hinge not on tanks or bombers, but on men who could fight where no army could follow. Recruits were chosen for endurance, not pedigree. Miners, trappers, loggers, men who knew the cold intimately, who could smell a storm hours before it struck. When the orders arrived for training in the frozen wilderness of Alberta, few understood that they were volunteering not for battle, but for an experiment in human limits. Morrow had been a miner before the war, a man used to darkness and silence. The army had given him a rifle, but it was the cold that taught him discipline. "You don't fight the cold," his instructor had said. "You negotiate with it." Their weapons froze, boots split open and rations turned to stone. Frostbite was the first enemy, invisible, patient, and cruel. At night the wind screamed across the tents, shaking the canvas like artillery fire. Men woke to find canteens solid with ice, eyelashes sealed shut. When they lit stoves, the fuel cracked and flared blue, filling the air with a sharp tang of burning kerosene and despair. By late January, a rumor spread through the camp that the British officers who'd conceived the project had already written them off. "Too slow, too cold, too costly," one memo read. "Canadians unfit for sustained operations." But none of those officers had stood knee-deep in snowdrifts for 14 hours, hauling sleds through whiteout conditions. None had felt the eerie silence that followed a blizzard, the way the world seemed to stop breathing. It was there, in that silence, that the winter soldiers were born. When the first live-fire exercise began, visibility dropped to 10 feet. Morrow led his squad through a stand of skeletal pines, the sound of their snowshoes a rhythmic crunch beneath the wind. Each man carried 70 pounds of gear, rifles, axes, ropes, and a single thermos of coffee that steamed like an altar offering when opened. A flare burst overhead, staining the snow red. Morrow signaled low, his voice buried by the gale. They advanced, shadows against a field of endless white. Somewhere ahead, machine guns opened fire, and tracer rounds sliced the darkness like orange meteors. He hit the ground hard. Snow filled his mouth, icy and metallic. The cold numbed everything, even fear. He crawled forward, the fabric of his jacket stiff with frost, his breath short and ragged. He could hear Private Levesque behind him, whispering a prayer in French, words stolen by the wind. They reached the mock bunker, charged, and cleared it in silence. When the firing stopped, Morrow realized he couldn't feel his feet. The blood in his boots had frozen. But when the officer called for withdrawal, he didn't move. He just stared into the blizzard, where the horizon had vanished. The next morning, 20 men were evacuated for frostbite. 3 never returned. Yet command marked the exercise a success. "Enemy bunker neutralized," the report read. "Morale stable." Stable, a word that meant nothing out there, where stability was a myth and endurance was the only measure of life. Weeks passed. The world shrank to routines of misery. Melt snow, eat ice-cold rations, march, dig, repeat. But something strange began to happen. The men stopped complaining. They adapted. They learned to read the wind, to sense when the ice beneath them would crack, to move silently even in snow up to their waists. Their eyes, once wide with fatigue, grew sharp, animal-like. When an American liaison visited to inspect the camp, he found them shirtless in sub-zero air, repairing sled runners with bare hands, laughing like madmen. "You call this training?" he had asked, shivering in his greatcoat. "No," Morrow had said quietly. "We call this survival." Then came the orders. Deployment to the Aleutian Islands, a desolate chain in the North Pacific where Japanese troops had entrenched themselves in a landscape so brutal even polar bears avoided it. Officially, It was a joint operation. Unofficially, it was a test. If the Canadians can't handle this, the brass had written, we'll scrap the whole experiment. When their transport ship cut through the fog and the black cliffs of Kiska Island came into view, the air reeked of salt and sulfur. It was August, but the wind felt like winter. Morrow stood on the deck, eyes narrowed against the spray. Looks like home, someone muttered behind him. But home had never been this silent. They landed before dawn. The beach was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered helmets, remnants of another battle fought months earlier. No one knew what waited beyond the ridgeline. The fog moved like breath, thick and alive. Every step forward was a gamble between ice and mud. They advanced in near-perfect silence, rifles low, eyes scanning the ghostly terrain. Somewhere in the mist a gull screamed and every man froze. Then came the smell, faint, unmistakable, wood smoke, human. They reached the first encampment by mid-morning. Empty tents, half-buried rifles, a cooking fire still smoldering beneath a ring of stones. But no soldiers, no bodies, no sound except the endless moan of the wind. The enemy had vanished into the fog. That night they camped near the coast. The cold gnawed through layers of wool and leather. Morrow lay awake, staring at the sky. The aurora flickered again, green and indifferent. Around him, men whispered, not about battle or strategy, but about home, about wives and rivers and things that didn't freeze. For the first time, the silence wasn't hostile. It was sacred. Morning brought the discovery. A Japanese radio, abandoned but still functional. They tuned it, listening to fragments of voices carried from across the Pacific. It wasn't propaganda or commands, just static and snatches of songs, music meant for men far from home. In that moment, the winter soldiers understood what no briefing could teach, that war, in the end, wasn't about enemies or flags. It was about endurance, of body, of spirit, of memory. By September, the campaign was over. The Allies had retaken Kiska, though the enemy had already withdrawn. Official reports called it a victory. The winter soldiers returned to Canada without medals or headlines. But when the Americans began their mountain operations in Italy months later, they used the Canadian training manuals, word for word. Techniques born in the white silence of Labrador now guided battles in the sunlit hills of Europe. Years later, when Morrow was an old man, a journalist asked him what he remembered most about that winter. He didn't mention the frostbite, or the fear, or even the fog. He just said, "We learned that sometimes the cold teaches you more than the war ever could." Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet, endless, unjudging. February 1943. The frozen north no longer shocked them. What once felt like punishment had become a kind of grim rhythm, a heartbeat in the silence. Sergeant William Morrow woke before dawn as usual, brushing the frost from his blanket, his eyelashes stiff with ice. The camp around him was still, half buried in snow, the canvas tents sagging like exhausted lungs. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, a wolf howled, long, distant, mournful. The sound didn't startle anyone anymore. It was part of the landscape now, as ordinary as breath. Each morning began the same way. Melt snow for water, scrape ice from rifles, flex fingers until they could move again. Then the march, 10 miles through waist-deep drifts, the horizon a gray blur. The instructors called it endurance training, but Morrow knew better. They weren't training for any battlefield. They were being erased and rewritten, turned into something else entirely. Men stripped down to the bare mechanics of survival. When the sun rose, it was weak and red, like a dying ember smothered by smoke. The air stung every inch of exposed skin. Even sound seemed frozen. The crack of a rifle echoing too slowly, boots crunching in delayed rhythm. Cold makes you see things, Private Levesque once muttered as they trudged along. Not ghosts, just truths. Morrow didn't answer. He was thinking about the absurdity of it all. The brass in London and Washington arguing strategy over maps, while here, in a wasteland that devoured everything human, they learned the only truth that mattered. You don't conquer nature. You endure it. By mid-morning, a blizzard rolled in. The men dropped to their knees, forming a huddle against the gale. Snow whipped across their faces, biting, blinding. The world vanished into white noise. Morrow shouted something, but his words were torn away. For an hour they waited motionless. When the storm passed, 2 men were missing. They found them later, a mile downwind, buried upright like frozen statues. There was no ceremony, just silence. That night, inside the mess tent, The air reeked of wet wool, smoke, and despair. Someone had managed to boil coffee, its bitter scent filling the gloom. A few men talked in low voices about rumors, that their unit would be disbanded, that the Americans had lost interest, that all this suffering had been for nothing. Morrow listened without speaking. He stared at the flickering lantern light on the canvas wall and thought about home, a mining town in northern Ontario, where winter had never felt like an enemy, only a fact of life. But this wasn't winter. This was war disguised as weather. A week later, new orders arrived. The 1st Special Service Force was to relocate south, Montana, for mountain warfare training. The men didn't cheer. After months of ice and silence, the idea of leaving the cold felt like betrayal. Still, they packed their sleds, dismantled the tents, and loaded onto trucks bound for the coast. As the engines rumbled to life, Morrow looked back at the barren expanse behind them, the place that had broken and rebuilt them. Snow drifted across the tracks, erasing every trace of their presence within minutes. It was as if they'd never existed. The journey south took days. Through the windows of the transport, the men watched the frozen wilderness slowly give way to forest, then to mountains rising like jagged teeth against the horizon. The convoy wound along narrow roads slick with ice. Occasionally, they'd pass small villages, clusters of wooden houses, smoke curling from chimneys, children staring wide-eyed at the soldiers inside the trucks. To them, these were heroes, but inside the vehicles, no one felt heroic. They were ghosts moving through a world that no longer recognized them. When they reached Montana, the sun was glaring, sharp, and unfamiliar. The air smelled of pine and iron instead of salt and snow. They were assigned to a remote base near Helena, surrounded by cliffs and frozen lakes. The Americans greeted them with cautious curiosity. "Canadians, huh?" one officer had said with a grin. "Let's see if you can handle real mountains." It was meant as a joke, but Morrow caught the undertone, the same quiet skepticism they'd faced from the start. The winter soldiers didn't respond. They simply unpacked and got to work. Training resumed immediately. Rock climbing, explosives, hand-to-hand combat, parachuting. The cold was less brutal here, but the pace was relentless. Every day began before dawn and ended long after sunset. Men collapsed in their bunks with muscles trembling and knuckles split open. The instructors demanded perfection, not speed. "When you fight in the mountains," one of them barked, "you don't rush death, you outlast it." For Morrow, the hardest part wasn't the exhaustion. It was the noise. After months of silence in the north, the shouting, the engines, the constant hum of drills felt wrong, intrusive. He found himself missing the quiet violence of the Arctic, where the cold itself seemed to listen. Yet slowly the men adapted. They became efficient, precise, terrifyingly competent. They learned to ski with rifles, to climb with dynamite strapped to their backs, to kill without sound. It was during this period that Morrow met Captain Tom Whitaker, an American officer who had fought in North Africa. Whitaker was tall, composed, and skeptical of everything Canadian. "You people think you know cold," he'd said during their first exercise. "Try sleeping under sand that burns your skin." But over time, his arrogance thawed. One morning, during a climb up a sheer ice face, Whitaker slipped and nearly fell. Morrow caught his rope, holding it steady until the captain found his footing again. They didn't speak of it, but afterward Whitaker began to look at the Canadians differently, not as subordinates but as equals. One evening, a rumor spread that Churchill himself had mentioned their unit in passing, calling it a curious experiment in endurance. The phrase stuck. Endurance became both insult and banner. They carved it into rifle stocks, whispered it before drills, and painted it on the side of a transport plane in crude black letters, "The Endurers." Spring came late that year, creeping over the mountains like a hesitant promise. Snow melted into rivulets that glistened beneath the pine trees. The men no longer looked like soldiers. They looked like something older, faces weathered, eyes hollowed, movements deliberate. They could climb cliffs in full gear, cross rivers waist-deep in meltwater, and fire accurately in blizzard conditions. But what truly set them apart was what happened after the drills, the quiet moments when they'd sit around the fire not speaking, just listening to the wind move through the pines. The Americans who trained alongside them called it the silence thing. They didn't understand it, and maybe they weren't supposed to. In early April, a high-ranking general visited the base. He watched their maneuvers in silence, his breath clouding the cold air. When the exercise ended, he turned to Whitaker and said, "They're not soldiers. They're instruments." It wasn't meant as praise, but it was. Within weeks, the winter soldiers were officially transferred to a classified operational unit, destination unknown. That night, as the men packed their gear once again, Morrow lingered outside the barracks. The moon hung low over the peaks, bathing the snow in pale light. He could hear the faint creak of ice shifting on the lake below, like the earth itself was breathing. Levesque approached, his breath visible in the cold. "You ever think we'll go home?" he asked. Morrow thought for a moment, then said, "Home isn't where you live, it's where you stop freezing." The wind carried their laughter away. A few days later, the trucks rolled out before dawn. No flags, no fanfare. Just the quiet grind of engines and the crunch of tires over frost. As they crossed the border into the United States proper, the radio crackled with news from overseas. Italy, Tunisia, Russia, names that felt like another planet. None of it mattered. Their war had already begun long before they'd fired a single shot. By the time they reached the coast, the Pacific stretched out before them, endless, gray, unknowable. The ships waited in the harbor, their hulls black against the water. The men boarded without ceremony. Somewhere behind them, the mountains stood in silence, snow still clinging to their peaks. Morrow paused at the top of the gangway, looking back one last time. He realized, with a heaviness he couldn't name, that they hadn't survived the winter. The winter had survived them, and in its quiet, merciless way, it had made them ready for everything that came next. August 15th, 1943, North Pacific Ocean. The sky was a sheet of iron, the sea beneath it black and violent. Rain fell in slanted knives, drumming on the steel deck of the USS Leonard Wood. The 1st Special Service Force stood assembled under the storm, silent, drenched, and motionless. They were en route to Kiska Island, one of the Aleutian outposts once held by Japan. Officially, the island had been evacuated weeks earlier. Unofficially, no one trusted the reports. "Expect ghosts," Captain Whitaker had told them during briefing. "Either the living kind or the ones waiting for company." Sergeant William Morrow stood near the bow, staring into the fog. The ocean looked endless, a cold mirror stretching toward nowhere. Every man on deck carried the same haunted expression, not fear, but fatigue carved deep enough to look like calm. They had trained for mountains, snow, and silence. What awaited them was all three, condensed into a single island forgotten by God. When dawn broke, the storm eased, revealing the Aleutian chain, a procession of jagged peaks rising from the mist, their slopes veiled in fog. Kiska was the last, an obsidian shard in the ocean wrapped in perpetual cloud. The coastline appeared only in fragments. A black cliff here, a beach of volcanic ash there, waves exploding against boulders slick with moss. The ship's loudspeaker crackled. "Prepare for landing." Engines rumbled to life below deck. The men gathered their gear, checked weapons, and waited for the signal. Morrow adjusted his pack straps until they bit into his shoulders. Around him, the air smelled of salt, fuel, and anxiety. "Cold as hell out there," Levesque muttered, tightening his gloves. Morrow gave a small nod. "Hell's warm," he said. Then came the whistle. The boats dropped into the water with a metallic groan, engines sputtering as they cut through the surf. The landing itself was chaos. Waves slammed the craft sideways, soaking ammunition boxes and freezing fingers. When the first group reached the shore, the world seemed to vanish into fog again. Visibility was less than 20 meters. The men advanced cautiously, rifles ready, hearts thudding in rhythm with the crashing surf. Morrow's boots sank into black sand. He tasted sulfur in the air. Somewhere inland, a faint metallic clang echoed, like a shovel striking rock. They pushed forward, following compass bearings more than sight. The terrain was treacherous. Mud, ash, ridges of sharp volcanic stone. The wind carried faint echoes that could have been voices, or just tricks of the fog. By mid-morning, they reached the first enemy camp. Empty, tent still standing half collapsed, cookpots filled with cold rice. A radio humming faintly, its dial flickering with static. Whitaker ordered a perimeter. Morrow and Levesque swept the area, finding nothing but abandoned rifles and footprints leading into the hills. "They're still here," Levesque whispered, "or they never left." The words hung in the mist like breath. For the next 2 days they combed the island. Nothing moved but fog and wind. No gunfire, no voices, no sign of life. It was as if the enemy had dissolved into the weather itself. Some of the men joked nervously about spirits, the Kiska ghosts. Others stopped talking altogether. The silence pressed on them like a physical weight. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place. On the third night, Morrow couldn't sleep. The tent flapped rhythmically in the wind, its canvas stiff with salt. He rose quietly, stepping outside. The fog glowed faintly under the aurora, a pale green shimmer rippling through the mist. He walked toward the ridge, boots crunching softly on gravel. At the summit he stopped. Below, the sea glimmered faintly, black waves folding over one another like breathing lungs. He closed his eyes and listened, and for a moment he swore he could hear singing. It wasn't a song in any language he knew, just a low, trembling hum, carried by the wind. It faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the creak of distant ice. Morrow stood motionless, feeling the cold seep through his coat, through his bones. When he finally turned back toward camp, he realized something strange. The sound hadn't been coming from the sea. It had been coming from beneath the ground. The next morning, he told Whitaker. The captain frowned. Skeptical but curious. Probably underground bunkers, he said. Let's find them. They organized a small recon team. Morrow, Levesque, and 2 Americans. Armed with shovels and ropes, they followed the faint vibrations Morrow claimed to have heard. Hours passed. The fog thickened. Finally, near a cluster of volcanic rocks, they found a narrow fissure, a slit in the earth wide enough for a man to crawl through. A faint metallic scent drifted upward. They descended one by one, flashlights slicing through the darkness. The tunnel walls were damp and slick, streaked with rust-colored veins. 50 feet down, they entered a chamber, an old Japanese supply depot, abandoned in haste. Crates stacked to the ceiling, their labels faded. A rusted typewriter on a desk, a map still pinned to the wall. And on the ground in the center of the room, a single open notebook. Levesque knelt, brushing away dust. The paper was covered in tight, neat handwriting, Japanese but dated just weeks before. Whitaker called for the interpreter. When the man arrived and began to read, the room fell silent. The journal belonged to a Japanese medic. Its last entry described the evacuation. Not a retreat, but a flight from something unseen. The fog is alive, it read. It whispers at night. Men vanish. We hear footsteps but find no tracks. No one spoke for a long time. Whitaker finally exhaled and said, "Let's go." But as they turned to leave, one of the flashlights flickered out. Then another. The darkness closed in. From somewhere deep in the tunnel came a low rumble, not mechanical but organic, like the groan of shifting ice or the heartbeat of the earth itself. They scrambled upward, boots slipping on wet stone. When they emerged into daylight, the fog had thickened again, swallowing the world. "We're not telling command about that," Whitaker said quietly. Morrow agreed. Some truths were better left buried. That evening, rain began to fall. Not the heavy tropical kind, but fine and relentless, soaking everything. The men huddled under makeshift shelters, smoking damp cigarettes, staring into the nothingness beyond camp. Morrow sat apart, turning the medic's journal over in his hands. The pages smelled faintly of mold and ink. Somewhere in those words was a truth he didn't want to understand, that maybe endurance had its limits and beyond them lay madness. Weeks passed. The island remained empty. The official reports called the mission a flawless recapture, though no enemy had been found. But the men who returned carried something invisible back with them, a stillness that never left their eyes. Back aboard the transport ship, Morrow stood at the rail as Kiska disappeared behind the fog. "You ever think about what they meant?" Levesque asked beside him. "The fog, the whispers." Morrow didn't answer. He watched the horizon fade until it was nothing but water and cloud. "Doesn't matter," he said at last. "Whatever it was, it stayed there." But that wasn't true. In the months that followed, strange patterns emerged. Men who had served on Kiska avoided sleep. Some said they still heard the wind hum at night. Others woke freezing, convinced they were back on the island. The doctors called it fatigue. The men called it the echo. By the time winter came again, Morrow had stopped speaking about Kiska altogether. He was assigned to mountain operations in Italy. Sun, stone, olive trees. Yet even under the Mediterranean light, he sometimes caught himself glancing toward the horizon, expecting fog to roll in. In one letter to his sister, written from a ridge near Monte la Defensa, he confessed, "It's strange, but I think the cold followed us. Not in temperature, in silence. It's inside us now. Maybe that's what they trained us for all along." When the Allied press finally celebrated the unit, the Devil's Brigade, they called them, the stories spoke of heroism, efficiency, courage. None mentioned Kiska. None spoke of how men could vanish without dying, how silence could shape a soldier more than any weapon. That December, Morrow led his squad up a frozen slope under artillery fire. He didn't flinch. The shells fell like distant thunder, snow blooming where they struck. His men said he moved through it like a shadow, calm, almost reverent. When the hill was taken, Whitaker found him standing alone near the summit staring north. "Looking for something?" he asked. Morrow smiled faintly. "Just wondering if the fog ever reaches this far." The captain didn't answer. He didn't need to. The wind had already begun to howl. March 1945, northern Italy. The war was nearing its end, though no one in the mountains believed it yet. Snow still clung to the cliffs. Gunfire still echoed through the valleys, and men still froze where they fell. The 1st Special Service Force had become a legend whispered among Allied troops, a ghost unit that appeared out of fog, struck without warning, and vanished before dawn. The newspapers called them the Black Devils, but among themselves they still used the old name, Winter Soldiers. Sergeant William Morrow had changed. His hair had gone gray at the temples, though he was barely 30. His eyes no longer searched for enemies. They watched the weather. Each gust of wind carried meaning now. Each shift in light a memory of something learned long ago in the cold north. He led quietly, almost gently. The younger men followed him without question, not because of rank, but because he seemed to see things before they happened. That winter, during the assault on Monte Rivole, a blizzard swept across the front, grounding aircraft and halting supply convoys. Most units dug in and waited. Morrow's didn't. They moved through the storm as if it were home. Snow fell so thick that visibility shrank to a few meters, yet they advanced uphill, ropes biting into frozen rock, hands raw and bleeding. By dawn, they had flanked the enemy line entirely. When the sun broke, the Germans found themselves surrounded by men they hadn't even heard approach. After the battle, Whitaker found Morrow sitting apart, his rifle across his knees, watching the melting snow drip from pine branches. "You saved 100 men today," the captain said. Morrow didn't look up. "We just walked where others wouldn't." When victory finally came that spring, there was no celebration for the Winter Soldiers. Their unit was disbanded quietly, its record sealed. The men went home scattered, back to farms, to mines, to silence. Morrow returned to Ontario. He built a cabin near the edge of a frozen lake, far from towns, far from noise. The world moved on, but he remained anchored in a season that never ended. Sometimes he would walk onto the ice at night, listening to the distant cracks beneath his boots, the sound echoing across the dark. Once, when asked by a journalist about the war, he said only, "Cold doesn't kill you. It teaches you what parts of you are worth keeping warm." He lived out his years there, quietly, the forest closing around him like an old friend. In the spring of 1967, a local boy found him sitting by the lake, eyes open, a faint smile on his face. On the table beside him lay his service knife and a small notebook. The first page held a single sentence written in a steady hand. "Even the Allies forgot us." But the winter never did. Outside, the ice was breaking, the water beneath whispering like breath. The season had finally moved on, but the silence it left behind was eternal.